Yeah,
Okay.
I think it was the evening time.
Okay.
Yeah.
News. While I get into this, just as a reminder to our Zoom land folks, please, okay, we had severe weather. Alexis was saying that yesterday. Okay. Yeah, I thought I saw something on the news. For those on Zoom land, do make sure you put your name in the chat so I can make sure I'm fair with your attendance. All right, so let's get into this. So, like I said, we're going to get into what's known as social identity theory, and I kind of want to start where this theory started from originally. Before we get into, well, okay. So first of all, let me explain what a social identity is in the first basic ways of describing it. Okay. Your social identity is anything that is part of you that is provided to you by your social world. So, for example, even down to your name, uh, your gender, especially your gender identity, um, your ethnicity, your culture. Um, uh, we have short-term social identities. So I'm hoping a short-term social identity for all of you is student, college student, right? But right now, that's an important, I hope, an important part of your identity. Um, uh, uh, your next occupation, therapist. What's that? Paralegal, right? So all of those will then become an important part of who you are. It'll be part of your defining person, okay? And what the original theorists wanted to know is they again went back to what happened in Germany, and they wanted to know why is it millions of people that came from probably one of the most cultured places in Europe at the time. I mean, this is the place that produced Einstein, Sigmund Freud, and many other great scientists in the areas of physics and biology. They have had always had a very rich culture. So this was not a country that was not knowledgeable. It wasn't a country that had weak, easy minds to persuade. Okay. But how is it that so many millions of people could just set aside and watch their country dominate and attack other countries, eliminate so many millions of Jews, gays, gypsies? How is it that you could just sit there and kind of say, well, okay, this is how it is. Okay. Now, don't get me wrong. When we're talking about World War II, there were plenty of dissenters. There was attempts on Hitler's life. There were coups. There were all kinds of things. So this isn't everyone we're talking about, right? But there were still millions of Germans who either actively or passively engaged in the killing of millions of people. And how could that happen? Okay. And after interviews, looking at it, and it came down to a single identity, and that was being a German. And having that German identity, which gave an individual pride, belonging, and meaning, allowed for that to occur. Okay. And this became known as social identity theory. That when we let our social identity engulf us, it sets us up for things like prejudice and discrimination. Okay. Now, this theory started late 50s, 1960s, 70s, and even through the 80s. It was primarily used to explain prejudice and discrimination. Okay. which it still explains very well. Okay. But getting into the 2000s, a lot of psychologists, I'm included in this camp, goes, well, there has to be some benefit, right? You can't just, people just don't become part of something with no expectations of getting anything out of it, right? And so, what is it about having a strong social identity is beneficial to human beings? Okay. And indeed, we have found people with strong social identities live longer, they live healthier, they're less likely to have diseases, they're less likely to get in trouble with the law. And so there's a whole bunch of benefits to having a strong social identity that you belong somewhere in this world. Okay. And so this is going to be the trick about identity is how do you balance being where you are, being a part of the people that you feel you belong to, but also how do we make sure that that doesn't then result in the dark side of identity where you start discriminating and being prejudiced towards other groups. Okay. So that's going to be kind of the trick we're going to try and work with over the next week or two. Okay. Welcome. We'll skip that corny video. It's really corny. But I want to talk about the opposite of having an identity, okay? Because there's always opposites, right? Because you can't define one without the other, okay? And so I want to talk about identity's counterpart, which is loneliness, okay? Loneliness is kind of a strange emotion, okay? Because loneliness is both is a motion, a negative emotion. It drives us to isolation. It drives us to protect ourselves. It makes us hyper vigilant and wary about other people. And that is happening in the amygdala hippocampal area, the areas of the brain that give us fight or flight. Okay. However, the other areas of the brain that activate are the motivational areas of the brain, mainly in the paralimbic area between the limbic system and the cortical area, which are high in what's known as dopamine, which is kind of the motivation neurotransmitter. It gets us rewarded for when we do something right. It's the thing that kind of gets us going and gets us towards our goals. Okay. And this area activates in a way to push us to socially connect with someone. So here we have these two polar opposite types of emotions. We have one trying to pull us away from people, and we're having one that pushes us towards other people. And if you can guess, some of the correlates of loneliness, if you think of these polar opposite poles to us, some prolonged loneliness is associated with things like the development of depression, especially chronic depression, substance use and substance abuse, high risk behaviors, because you're feeling this twisting between these two polar opposites of motivation versus negative emotion and resistance. Okay. Um, and there are two types of loneliness that we've noted. One is social loneliness. If you look in a lot of the current literature, this is called social isolation. So if you're interested in this type of research, that's normally the term that is used in the literature. And this is when we experience a feeling of that when a person does not feel they have sufficient number of social connections. Okay. When we don't feel like if, for example, if I fell sick today, there'll be no one there that would come and help pick me up and help me out. Okay. Or if I got in trouble, maybe a flat tire on the way to Tucson or Cells, do I have someone who I could call that would come? Okay. That's kind of social loneliness and that feeling of I really have no one that is really there for me. Okay. One way to kind of think about this is I think of people like on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok. There's people who have to have thousands of friends, right, to feel like they're kind of validated and whatnot on Facebook. I have one friend who I'm fortunate to be one of them. He has 10 friends. And he's like, that's all I need. That's all I need. And so one of the things both with both these types of loneliness is it's a subjective thing. Just like eating and drinking and relationships and friendships, it's very subjective how much social connection or whatnot we need. Okay. Um, and then the second type of loneliness is emotional loneliness. Okay. This is the experience when we have a loss of a truly emotionally connected relationship. Okay. So, for example, the loss of a parent, if you're close to your parent, a loss of a friend, um, 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 a loss of a spouse or a intimate partner. Okay. All of these can lead to that loss of emotional connection with someone. All right. And again, these two can work together. Again, some people only need a few emotional connections. Others need a lot. I had a friend once who, when she was going through a crisis, she'd call me, then she would call another friend, and then she'd call her mom, and then she'd call her sister, and she need to, all of those emotional connections to really resolve what she was going through. On the other hand, I've had other friends who can call one person, work through it, and they're fine. Okay. So this is again another example of how subjective this is in a way. And so when you think about what makes you lonely, think about what your numbers are, what you need to feel like you're truly connected with your world. Okay. Um, Now we do need to part this from something known as social rejection, okay? Because this is actually a different experience than prolonged loneliness or the experience of loneliness, okay? Social rejection is at that first point when someone breaks up with us or we get rejected for that job or we just get rejection, okay, from another human being, okay? Interesting though, I do have to put a sideline on this. There is research with pets that when your pet rejects you, we're starting to go through the same process, which is kind of funny. So, you know, our animals, I guess, are as important as us humans. So we'll see about that. But anyways, social rejection is a different, interesting experience because again, when we look at the brain, it reacts to the opioid areas of the brain, the pain receptors of the brain, the area of the brain that activates when you cut your hand, break your leg, have soreness, pain, any type of physical pain is what our brain is reacting to when another human rejects us. So if you want to think about it, that idea that when someone breaks up with you, you have a broken heart, in a sense, physically, that's what the brain is registering, that you actually do have a broken heart. Okay. And so this is kind of an interesting thing to consider. Because this is totally different than what we experience afterwards when we then don't reconnect with the social world and we become lonely. Okay. Now, other interesting research. This is just interesting research on social rejection. If someone breaks up with you or you're rejected, take Tylenol. Tylenol has shown to be an effective medication to reduce the pain of social rejection. Um, don't follow the normal advice that people give you. Okay, the normal advice is that you should take time for yourself, get to know who you are, da 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 da. But is that what we do when we have a physical injury? No, we actually try to get our body back to physical fitness as soon as possible, right? Okay. So actually, one way to reduce rejection is instead of staying home and feeling bad for yourself or get to know yourself, go to a dance, go to a party, go be with other people. And that will also, again, just like with a physical injury, return you back to um, that state. Yeah, Angelina, I hear you. It would have been nice. But yes, Tylenol does work. It actually, the second thing that I pointed out about going back into your social world, normally rejection, the pains of rejection last about 60 to 90 days, the severe ones. Going out into the world actually will reduce them to 20 days. Tylenol will reduce the pains down to about 2 weeks. And then you'll kind of go into, instead of that, the loneliness state. So just some interesting physiological findings. So, okay. But why is it that we have such a, so that those are the things that happen when we don't have those social connections in our world. But what happens on the cognitive and emotional level? What does feelings of belonging, how, how do they why is it that on a cognitive level, right, and an affective level, do we seek out belonging to someone, okay, or a need for strong and stable relationships? If we look at these two bubbles, there's really two really cognitive reasons. There's self-awareness and self-esteem. Okay. Under the relatively cognitive motives of self-awareness, we want to be around others and belong for to understand and control. On the meta level, we want to understand who we are as an individual. So we use people who are like us to give us a better understanding of who we are, what our history is, where we belong. And we want to be able to control that. We want to be able to have control over our own self and our own identity by understanding where we come from, who we belong to. Okay. On a micro level, we also use this, right? Um, uh, so for example, this is an example I always use in these classes is let's say we were all here on campus, or maybe we had the videos well, we can't do that with the videos. We were all here on campus in this classroom, and if these tables are sturdy enough, imagine if in the middle of a lecture, I just got on top of the table and started dancing. Okay. Now we get a smile, but if I were to record you, what I would see is you would look to your left and you would look to your right. Because what are you doing? You're looking at other people's reactions and trying to decide, did the professor go crazy or should we? So that's the understanding part. The controlling part is, should we intervene? Okay. So on the micro level, we use the people around us to kind of understand and control our current situation. Okay. On the self-esteem, and don't worry, I don't think these tables are sturdy enough, gang, so don't worry about that. Self-esteem level, which self-esteem is basically this effective, am I good or am I bad? Am I worthy or am I worthless? It's a basic kind of evaluation that we do. Okay. And for this, we use other people, for example, self-enhancement. Okay. Especially when the people are like us. We really like that validation when we know that that person who we feel understands us, belongs with us, gives us that, hey, good job. Okay. And on the trusting end, now trusting, I don't want you to think about it like in developmental psychology where it's attachment type stuff where, can I trust you to help me knowing that if you need help, I'll help you. It's not that kind of trusting. trusting in this world uh, um, is that are the people around us benign? Okay, meaning we want to know if the person sitting next to us are going to harm us or are just going to be there. Okay. And again, going back to the idea of identity, we feel much safer around people we know than people we don't know. So we seek out those individuals. Okay. And if we looked again at the whole heuristics, which we'll be talking about later, I would imagine on either a subconscious, unconscious, or sometime conscious level, when you walk into a crowded room, or when any of us walk into a crowded room, the first thing we're going to do is divide people by gender. Then we're going to divide them by age. And then we're going to divide them by ethnicity. Then we're going to divide them by familiarity, such as are they family, neighbors, those kinds of things. And then we're going to go sit at that table that we feel we belong to. Okay. And we'll do this either on an unconscious or a conscious level. And it's a heuristic to make it so that we get this idea of trusting because we don't want to be by people that we don't know and may be harmful. Okay. So these are kind of the cognitive things. Okay. Um, the slide that is missing here, though, is on kind of the evolutionary biological level, okay, in what happens when we don't have belonging, okay? And so we're going to look here in just a few minutes the consequences of loneliness, and we will see that loneliness on a biological level is a better predictor of mortality and morbidity than is smoking, exercise habits, and eating lifestyle. Okay. I want you to think about that. So, mortality, the probability of when we will be deceased, okay, age wise. Morbidity, the probability of developing a chronic illness or an illness of any kind, even down to a flu. Okay. So I want you to think about that. Your social connection or lack thereof predicts mortality and morbidity better than your eating habits and your exercise habits and whether you smoke or do other drugs or alcohol. That's kind of significant, right? And growing evidence is showing that loneliness actually changes the genetics of your immune system. It takes away some of the alleles, I think they're called. I can't remember right at the top of my head, that then weakens the immune system permanently. Okay. And in fact, the one research that came out a couple years ago said 1 week of loneliness is like smoking 15 packets of cigarettes. So, just on the physiological end, our bodies are wired to seek out connection and belonging. Okay. But let's give a little bit more definition of what social identity and where culture fits in to this whole thing. I'm going to use, going back to our introduction psychology thing, I'm going to mention William James, okay? Because William James coined two terms in psychology that we use all the time, and that is a person's self-concept, okay? And he coined the term self-esteem. And what he defined the self-concept as is everything that you can say is you. Okay. Right down to your home address, he would argue. Okay. And the definition he originally coined for self-esteem is your evaluation of your self-concept, whether you think that who you are as a human being is worthy or not. Okay. Within the self-concept, he developed two types of identities that we have. The first one is our personal self or personal identity. He actually originally coined this our spiritual self because this is who we are that is just uniquely us. These are the things that set you uniquely apart from the person sitting next to you. Okay. So this includes things like personality, right? Temperament, your emotional response to the world, um, whether you have heightened motivational levels or lower motivational levels, all of those different types of things that are just uniquely you. Okay. Your social identity, again, going back to the beginning of this lecture, is everything that you can say is you based on what the world has given to you, that has defined you. So I mentioned things like gender, age, race, ethnicity, your culture, occupation, and the list goes on and on and on. Okay. Now you'll notice in this self-concept that there are overlaps between our personal identity and our social identity. Because for some identities, they become very melded. That what makes you unique also is part of your social identity. So, for example, people who strongly identify with their gender, that they feel their gender makes them unique. That's both a social identity that has melted with their personal identity. People, for example, individuals who feel like being Tana Awesome makes them unique compared to the people sitting next to them and is an important, very important aspect to identifying who they are as a unique individual. Those are two identities that have melded together. Okay. There's other identities, though, that are just unique to you, such as your emotional responses, your temperament, personality factors, and there's social identities that you recognize as you, such as being a college student, being right down to if you drive a car, okay, a driver. All of those things probably are part of your identity, but not necessarily something that you go, you know what, I drive a car and that will make me unique compared to all you. That probably doesn't really make sense. I'm sure maybe a race car driver, maybe, but those kind of set out to the other edge. Okay. So this is kind of our self-concept. Okay. And again, when we talk about culture, culture can either set within this overlap or it can be out here somewhere. If I were to tell you my experience, mine set somewhere out here, okay? Because for the majority of my life, who I was culturally was not really defined, okay? It was something that was ignored by my family. And so it was nothing that I ever really could connect with because I come from a family of gypsies where we moved everywhere. Okay. And we were never in one place for very long. And so for me, my culture identity sits somewhere out here. For some good close friends of mine, I can think of some of the, especially Tana Otham professors, but even some of the, their culture, they talk about it all the time as part of who they are as a unique person. Okay. And so those are kind of some examples of how culture can influence those things. All right. So I'm going to skip that part. So let's talk about, though, the connection between identity and loneliness. Can having just a social identity, a strong sense of who you are, be a buffer to the experience of loneliness when you lose social connections or when you lose emotional connections? Okay. So let's look at this research. So first of all, I won't get too much into the technical parts of this, but let's start with the uncircled part. So this one that says cognitive control and just a control group. Okay, these are individuals who established the baseline. They weren't they took the measures under certain conditions that we would normally find ourselves, and they establish what is known as these baselines. These baselines represent what the average amount of loneliness we experience, whether just thinking about it or whether it's passive. Okay. So this one represents the one for social loneliness. This green one represents it for emotional loneliness. Now, I want you to think about the simple procedure that was used in this experiment. Okay. The simple procedure is that you either did it online or you went into a lab and you were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. You were either assigned to a social identity condition or a personal identity condition. Okay. And the only thing you were asked in the social identity condition, the research originally started with students and then it went on to, for example, parents, occupational, and all those kinds of things. But let's go with the original one. They used college students in this and they simply asked, what are 5 positive qualities about being a college student? That was it. Okay. In the personal identity um, 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 situation, all they were asked is what are 5 positive qualities that make you unique compared to everyone else? That was it. And then they were given a measure of loneliness. Okay. Now, think about this. So one is kind of an isolating question. It's only asking just who are you? The other one is making you think about a question that makes you connected to others. So just that simple question. And the results were kind of remarkable if you really look at this graph. You'll notice that for the social identity, they were way less than baseline, meaning it made them more connected, didn't even get to baseline loneliness. But if you look at the ones who focus primarily on themselves, they came out almost twice as lonely as the baseline. Okay. So think about this. When you only focus on the individual you are, who you are, it puts you into a state of loneliness, which can lead to depression, anxiety, and all of those things. But when you focus on who you are with who you belong to, it becomes much more healthy for you. Okay. And this is why I think we discussed it before class a while ago. This is why in a lot of therapies, even very good therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is kind of the gold star right now for all kinds of disorders, we have found that including a person's identity, especially their social identity, who they are connected with in their world, actually increases the effectiveness of even cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay. And so we're finding so many uses for helping people identify who they are and who they belong to that it is even helping in therapies. Okay. So something to think about when you're feeling anxious or depressed, because I know those are emotions that make us avoid people. Maybe we should pick up the phone and call someone. Okay. And maybe that would be a better answer than isolation. Okay. So now let's talk about severe failure to belong. Okay. And these come down to some of the correlates and associates with what happens when we have especially extended periods of losses of who we are. So we have a denial, loss, or damage to one's social identity. Okay. If we think about this in the short term, it's someone with an occupational identity, they get fired or retire. Okay. The individuals with the highest risk of suicide are men between the age of 55 and 65. Okay. Why is that? Well, we know for a large number of men, their occupational identity, what they do for work, was a important part of who they were their entire life. And what are you doing between 55 and 65? You're trying to let go of that identity and go into the retirement age and phase of life, right? Your workplace is expecting less of you because of age discrimination. There's this loosening of this tie, and that loss of identity can result in um, the things like suicidal behavior, especially in that group that we see. Okay. And I will note we're actually seeing this uptrend as women become more occupationally focused. We're actually seeing increased levels of suicide for women who are starting to go through their retirement age as well. Something to kind of think about when we get to those ages. We can also think of this again from the macro level. Okay. For example, what happened with boarding schools and colonization here in the United States. Okay. A lot of these problems that we see are a lot of issues that many Native Americans have experienced. Okay. Because of that. And again, when we find what we find, especially among on that macro Native American level, is that when natives reclaim their identity, guess what? Health goes up, well-being goes up, longevity goes up. So again, we see these things. So we have this damage or loss. This leads to this emotional loneliness and social loneliness. Who do I belong and where do I belong? If this extended, this goes into what's called a failure to survive. We basically, if you want to use a different term, start to self-destruct. We stop showing up to work. We stop engaging in our social world. We feel lost. It could include substance abuse. And this again leads to that lower mortality, lower morbidity. And then this is all the things that are associated with it: suicide, addiction, relationship problems. It's even associated with things like chronic loneliness. I've mentioned depression, criminal behavior, gang affiliation, aggression towards others in society. Okay. So all of these are kind of associated with that loss of identity and who we belong to. Okay. All right. So we talked about those positive ends. Why should we um, gain a sense and a strong sense of who we are? But what, again, going back to the thesis that social identity started with, what are some of the downfalls of having an identity? Okay. So again, I'm just mentioning these things and we'll go through this list. Social identity was originally developed to understand how mass number of peoples can engage in horrific acts. Okay. And it brings up what's known as social comparison theory and self-esteem theory. Okay. We make our who we are a part of us. And we want to enhance us, right? We want to feel good about who we are. Therefore, we want to feel good about our group. Okay. What's one way to make yourself feel good about yourself? Well, to compare yourself to people who are not like us. Okay. So, and if you want to think about this, I think people do this on social media all the time, right? And so we compare ourselves to those and we then evaluate, yeah, okay. And this can lead to a negative evaluation, right? So someone who sees someone who's like us and they have 1 million likes on Instagram and we only have two or three, that can lead to some dangerous things as well. But we generally then use cognitive tools to kind of justify those differences, right? But so social comparison theory is this idea we compare, right? And because we like to think well about ourselves, our in group, we often evaluate our out group as less than or more than ours. Okay. Uh, since we want to think well of ourselves, we tend to give a negative evaluation. And there's two ways that we do this. We either do upward comparison. So this is if we feel we're part of, for example, a subculture, we upwardly compare to a more dominant culture and say, okay, well, this is why they're the way they are. Okay. They're the prejudiced ones. They're the da da da. And they may be, don't get me wrong on that level, but we kind of do these justifications. Okay. Or we try to work towards being that other group. Okay. Or downward comparison. We compare ourselves to individuals who we think are not equal to us. Both of them are an attempt to lead to a better feeling, a better wanting of who we are compared to others. Okay. So this is then what leads to things like prejudice and discrimination. On the low level, it makes us negatively evaluate people and maybe not evaluate people fairly based upon who they are. On the high level, it can lead to prejudice towards other ethnic, racial groups. It can lead to, according to these theories, to things like apartheid, all of those things, and genocide and whatnot. So some kind of negative parts of social identity. Now, what some of the literature has been showing, though, is that actually by giving a complete understanding of one's social identity, okay, you can actually stave off some of the discrimination and prejudice. Okay. It seems to be that people who have a strong social, let's do a cultural identity. People who have a strong cultural identity, but have a vague understanding of their culture. So they kind of know what their culture is and they kind of, okay, okay. They are more likely to go to prejudice and discrimination. Those who tend to not have, who have a very strong understanding of their cultural identity. They understand where they come from and who they are. Um, Tend to not be as prejudiced because they know who they are. That means someone else, because I have a strong identity, I don't need to compare to you. I don't need to, and maybe I want to understand you. Okay. And so having a clear understanding instead of a vague understanding tends to stave these things off. We can bring up research that are done on white European Americans. Okay. So about, I think it's 98% of white European Americans are immigrants. Okay. Only 2% come from that original 13 colonies on the East Coast. Okay. Yet, what many white European Americans who are at second, third, and fourth generation are taught is they are taught that they come from those 13 colonies. Okay. Those individuals who have that vague, don't understand that they were actually immigrants, that their culture is based upon George Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, all of those individuals tend to have higher levels of prejudice and discrimination. Okay. White European Americans who understand their immigrants and their immigrant roots and that they weren't here when the revolution happened. And most weren't here when the Civil War happened. And they understand that they are here as immigrants and have an identity with that, tend to be less prejudiced. Okay. Again, it's vague versus a solid understanding. Okay. So things to consider. All right. Now, I think I've mentioned in the class before, I'm not sure, but there is a lot of we do live in a multicultural world, especially here in the United States. where people can have multiple cultural identities. Okay. And one research wanted to know what happens when those identities compete with each other. Okay. What happens when, for example, we can use, for example, a lot of this research was done with Asian Americans. What happens when the Asian collective take care of mom and dad, family orientation conflicts with the United States, individual, go grow your own, develop yourself kind of identities clash with each other. Um, and some research has been done on some Native American communities. What happens when the cultural identity of that person's native heritage versus the dominant United States, and those two cultures clash with each other? What tends to happen? And this is interesting because it's a cognitive thing that happens. We end up not being the individuals in this situation tend not to be able to do what's called future time orientation. Future time orientation is the ability to think about where you'll be next week, a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and actually imagine yourself in those places. Okay. That ability kind of is repressed and individuals become current oriented, meaning the only thing that matters to that person is what's happening here and now. And so I'm just going to be here, focus on my current crisis, my current situation, but don't have that ability to think about how do I get out of this situation? How do I become who I want to be? Okay. So just kind of an interesting thing when our identities tend to clash with each other. Um, I've noticed this on a subjective observational level. I've noticed this with students who are graduating from college, and you're having two identities that are going to start to clash, right? The exiting college student identity and the future occupational identity. Okay. And indeed, most college students go through a period of deep depression after graduation. And it's actually very predictable. There's actually a lot of universities that their health program will follow their graduates for a couple months after they graduate, just check in with them, especially if they have a history of depression or anxiety or something like that. Okay. Because it's almost predictable that that will happen. Okay. And we think it's because of the switching, conflicting. I was a college student. I still feel like a college student, but now I am this something else. Okay. So that's another example beyond culture that we kind of see where these identities can compete with each other and create havoc. And again, the main one that we're finding is this time orientation. Okay. All right, so just some other examples. So this is some current research from 2023 and 2024, and we'll wrap up with this today. Actually, you know what? Let's skip this for today because there's some changes I need to make for it. I just remembered that. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop the recording.